Hello everyone! Today I'm gonna be talking about animation, specifically about different kinds of animation used in video games. To kick things off, let's start with 2D animation. There are two main methods of 2D animation that are used in video games. The first method is frame-by-frame animation. It's exactly as you imagine. Someone has to draw every frame by hand. For example, games like Cuphead and Hollow Knight use this kind of animation. This process is incredibly resource intensive and requires skilled artists and bloats the size of the video game, because every frame of an animation is a separate sprite that takes up space. Because of these reasons, this method is only used in places where you absolutely have to nail every pixel. For example, games on the SNES like Super Mario World or Donkey Kong Country, which are still considered to be good looking. There is a way to make a 2D pixel art game without doing any pixel art through shaders and post-processing, but that's for another video. If you are not trying to nail every single frame though, you can try out keyframe animation. Keyframe animation is a form of animation where you set keyframes. Keyframes are set points between which movement happens. So if your object is in point A and you want it to move to point B, you can set two keyframes on points A and B, so the computer can do all the math for you. After this, you will get a smooth animation of the object moving from point A to point B. It is also a lot easier to create since most of the work is done by the computer moving the object to the position the developer set. This method is usually used when the developer needs to animate a solid object, like a spaceship or a car in a cutscene. But it can also be used for smaller things during games. For example, moving a door handle or flipping a lever. Actually, you can go even further with keyframe animation. There is such thing as skeletal animation, which is basically keyframe animation on steroids. What is skeletal animation, I hear you ask? Basically, we create bones, and after we create them, we can start moving them using keyframe animation. Why is this a step up, you may ask? Well, because before that we could only move the object as a whole, and now we may move its different parts depending where we have put out bones. So, skeletal animation is basically just turning and moving around parts of a game object using a skeleton rig, with a skeleton rig being a collection of bones. All bones are in a strict hierarchy of parent-child, where a parent controls the movement of a child. A rig is also used with both forward and inverse kinematics at the same time. If you don't know what that is, don't worry, I will explain that later. Skeletal animation is usually used in animating complex objects like a person or a creature. It also gives the developers a lot of flexibility not only in 2D but also in 3D, because they don't have to make each movable part into a separate object, making the final result look better and the workflow easier. And now to kinematics. In forward kinematics, the developer moves all the bones in a chain all by himself, and then records the movements as keyframes. Pretty straightforward, and it's used everywhere. For example, if I would want a character to wave, I would use forward kinematics. Inverse kinematics, on the other hand, is a mathematical algorithm, which calculates how and where bones of a rig need to be placed in order for them to stretch from point A to point B. It is incredibly useful if the developer would want a foot or a hand to stick to a surface or be suspended in the air. Not only is it useful in keyframe animation, but also when the developer would want to make a character interact with the environment around it, for example, walking on uneven surfaces. And now that we know which methods are used in video games, we can have a talk about the main topic of this video: procedural animation. Let's work on an example. This is an astronaut. It is controlled by a player in VR and the in-game physics engine. And right now it is static. Let's divide the task of animating it into a few simple steps: leg animation, arm animation, head animation, body animation, and physics interactions. For the hierarchy, let's just attach everything to the body. So, the head animation is pretty simple. We can do it by casting a ray from the position of the player's camera and then making the bone that is responsible for the head simply face the point where the ray hits something. Or you could just make the rotation value of the player's camera be the same as the rotation value of the head bone. But I think that this doesn't look as good as the raycast method. For the arms, it's a bit more complicated, as here not only do we have to use inverse kinematics, but also pay attention to the physics part, so that the arms can just phase through walls. In my video game, I did it like this. I take the position of the player's controller and make the target for the arms follow it using physics. So when the controller goes through a wall, the arm that follows the target doesn't, because it follows a target that has physics. Then the inverse kinematics algorithm does its magic and bam, cool looking arm animation. And for dessert, feet. Again, I did it like this. I took the speed with which the player is moving and plugged it into how fast the animation is played. Then the direction that the player is moving and plugged it into the direction where the legs are supposed to step. And at last, the body. I made it so whenever a limit on a difference in degrees between the body and the camera is met, the body starts to rotate with the camera. And now that the beautiful animation algorithm is done, we can indulge ourselves in the fruits of our labor. And it looks like trash. Yeah, that's the problem with inverse kinematics. It looks incredibly robotic. But there is a solution. To fix that, we can add regular keyframe animation to the character to give it a little bit of life. And it sounds awesome. I mean, to make two almost completely opposite ways of animating and combining them into one to make a stunning result. And it is awesome. But just like anything awesome in this world, combining keyframe animation and inverse kinematics is incredibly hard, because you are already doing the keyframe animation for a lot of things, because they can't be achieved by inverse kinematics, and you are doing the above mentioned inverse kinematics. That takes a lot of time and effort, compared to if you would just do it with keyframe animation. And that's why many games straight up don't use procedural animation in favor of regular animation. And if you don't know how to animate at all, you could use inverse kinematics only, but you would somehow either have to hide the roboticness of it by making the image pixelated or distorted, or just saying it's stylization, and moving on. One game I think did it incredibly well is Brain World, which used inverse kinematics, physics and a little bit of combining multiple sprite sheets together to achieve the alive feel. Which leads us to the last part of procedural animation I want to discuss here. Physics. With physics we can do soft bodies like cloth or jelly, ragdolls like the ones you see flying around in Gary's mod, jiggle physics in your favorite gacha game, and much more. So up first is cloth. Basically, to do that, the developer needs to make a net or a mesh of points at which the surface can bend. Usually these points are just the vertices on a 3D mesh, so the more polygons, the more places a piece of cloth can bend. Then there are also soft bodies. Let's imagine a cube of jello. How would we, as developers, let the computer know how to move it? Yep, that's right, it's a net of points that either attract or repel the nearby points depending on how far or how close they are to each other. This method is not that resource hungry on its own, but it can scale very quickly, depending on the quality of the mesh. So, soft surfaces like that are pretty rare in video games. Up next, ragdolls. It's pretty simple. Take all the bones in a rig, give the bones constraints on how they can and can't rotate, and attach physics to each one. Enjoy the result. And in the end, jiggle physics. If a developer were to do the same that they did to a ragdoll, but only with one bone, and make the constraints on rotation a lot stricter, then they will get jiggle physics. There are a lot more examples of where physics can be used in animation, but the runtime of this video isn't infinite. So I have to wrap this up by joining all the animation methods together. How do I do that though? Well, it's kinda complicated. And to understand that, we first need to understand how regular keyframe animation gets implemented into video games. Usually, a game engine has an animation controller, which I think is self-explanatory. And in this animation controller, you can put different animations and then connect them, so that if the conditions of the connections are met, then the next animation plays. For example, if W is pressed, then idle animation stops playing and walking forward animation starts playing. Now that we know how to implement regular animation, we practically already know how to mix it with procedural animation. Now it's just that instead of play walk cycle if W is pressed, we have to play idle animation if player is idle. Or play foot animation if the foot is 1/4 of the step in. Or we turn the ragdoll on if the player is dead. Or turn off the jiggle physics if the jiggly object is suddenly turns into stone. And that's, my friends, how procedural animation is done. Except I let the part out where the developers is actively hating themselves during the parameter tuning, because it's boring and kinda sad. Thanks for watching and bye!